Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Tuesday the 20th of September. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 209 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. The proxy Russian authorities in 4 occupied areas of Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, have all announced their intentions to hold referendums between the 23rd and 27th of September on joining the Russian Federation. Dmitry Medvedev, Putin's hawkish longtime ally, today backed the calls for the referendums in the occupied areas. The sudden rush to hold votes comes as Ukraine recapture a village close to the eastern city of Lysychansk, in a small but symbolic victory that means Russia no longer has full control over the Luhansk Oblast, which was one of Putin's key war aims. Luhansk governor Sergei Haidai said Ukraine's armed forces were now in complete control of the village of Bilohorivka. The pace of Ukrainian forces' advance in the northeast has thrown Russian forces into a panic, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his nightly address. The president said he was now focused on speed in liberated areas, pointing to the speed at which our troops are moving, the speed in restoring normal life. Ukrainian forensic experts have so far exhumed 146 bodies, mostly of civilians, at a mass burial site near Izium in the east of the country, the regional governor said yesterday. Ukraine's armed forces have sunk a barge carrying Russian troops and equipment across the Dnieper River near Nova Kakakovka in the Kherson region, the Kiev Independent is reporting. Security fears have almost certainly led Russia's Black Sea Fleet to relocate its Kilo-class submarines from Sevastopol in Crimea to Novorossiysk in southern Russia. Liz Truss is expected to vow to match the UK's spending on military support to Ukraine next year at the same level as this year, when she speaks at the UN General Assembly. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has told PBS in the US in an interview that all the land invaded by Russia should be returned to Ukraine, including Crimea. Hungary's foreign minister has said the EU should not consider new sanctions against Russia, as that would only deepen the energy supply crisis and hurt Europe. And a US defense official has told CNN that the possibility of the US providing tanks to Ukraine is absolutely on the table. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this evening by a fantastic guest, Drew Hendry MP. Drew has been the SNP MP for Inverness, Badenoch and Strathspey since the 7th of May 2015. He became MP by beating Danny Alexander, who'd been the MP for more than 10 years. Prior to that, Drew served on the Highland Council and served on the council since 2007. He is now the SNP spokesperson on international trade. Drew, good evening. How are you?
Good evening, Andrew. Yes, very well, thank you, and thanks for having me on.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for giving us your time this evening, Drew. We greatly appreciate it. Our first story this evening is that business investment in the UK fell to the lowest rate in the G7 group of wealthy nations, despite corporation tax cuts. The government has been warned as ministers prepare £30 billion of giveaways targeted at companies and high-income workers. The Institute for Public Policy Research said a race to the bottom on the headline tax rate on company profits had failed to boost investment and economic growth in Britain over the past 15 years. The new report by the IPPR Commission on Economic Justice shows that the UK economy isn't working and is in need of urgent reform. The SNP has said that reform should include Scotland having powers over all the major economic levers. The SNP says that the report reinforces the findings of recent Scottish Government independence papers, which showed that a similar-sized independent country to Scotland are fairer, wealthier and happier than the UK. The SNP MSP Michelle Thompson said, "This IPPR report reinforces exactly what the recent Scottish Government papers say. The UK economy is broken, with Westminster control, and is failing far too many people in Scotland and across the UK, with neighbouring countries faring far better on a whole range of social and economic league tables. Coming so soon after the Financial Times report on how the UK trails far behind its peers and faces being overtaken by former communist bloc countries like Slovenia and Poland, it just underscores how badly Westminster is failing Scotland's people. She's continued, these independent findings are a wake-up call to Scottish politicians who continue to support the status quo of Westminster control, while one of Liz Truss's big ideas to combat this Tory-made cost of living crisis seems to be to remove the cap on bonuses for millionaire bankers. So, Drew, it's pretty clear that radical and ambitious policy changes are required if Scotland's economic performance is going to be transformed. We need to address issues like low productivity, poor business birth rate, and a lack of success with scale-ups of businesses, all of those things help to explain why Scotland's GDP per head is 44% of Singapore's, 48% of Ireland's, 68% of Norway's, and 75% of Denmark's. Those are an example of some pretty damning indictments of UK economic policy, aren't they?
Well, the damning indictments of UK policy to date, and the really troubling and worrying thing is that far, far from just wanting to continue those, the Truss government looks like it wants to accelerate the inequality, the difference that we see between the countries that we should be matching and should be actually outperforming given Scotland's wealth and resources. This is utterly damning. The IPP, the independent report from the IPPPR, shows that there is no excuse for Scotland not to be given the powers that it needs. But given the intransigence at Westminster, the fact that they continue to act in a way that harms Scotland on so many levels, from economic to social policy and more, and we're not able to make the kinds of advances here that we should be making in terms of the things that people want. We would want to put more into into the health service. We'd want to put more into councils. That's not possible under the situation we have at the moment, where we're even prevented from having borrowing powers that would allow us to make these significant changes. And this is just a further underlining of the fact that Westminster is absolutely broken, but it's broken in a way that is doing real and serious harm to people and families up and down the length and breadth of Scotland, as well as the other nations of the UK. But we have a choice. We have a different path that we could be taking. And as every day goes forward, when we get more and more of this information coming out, it becomes absolutely crystal clear to many people who hadn't perhaps seen this before, that the independence is the only way for us to be able to break this cycle and make the changes that we need to make for our people.
Thanks, Drew. Following on from those kind of statistics that I was reeling off there, Scotland's GDP per head has been about 8% lower, 8 percentage points lower than the UK as a whole for many years, and many economists suggest that that's as a result of comparatively poorer productivity. What have you got any thoughts as to what is at the root of that comparatively poorer productivity that we've seen in Scotland over the years?
Well, our productivity levels compared to the UK have actually been relatively good over the past number of years. The real difficulty with GDP has been the kind of massacre of the manufacturing industry that we saw from the 1980s and 1990s that meant that we've had to rebalance our economy in a different way. And now what we have is an economy that has in recent years been starting to perform a lot better, but many smaller and medium-sized enterprises, of course, since Brexit, those businesses have been directly targeted by the policies at Westminster. And again, we find ourselves under pressure and under the destructive pressure of choices that are made at Westminster that seek to harm the business growth and GDP that we have here in Scotland. It's a small miracle that we're able to perform so well on food and drink and other exports just now, given the barriers that have been put up, the quite savage costs that people are having to pay to export and indeed import parts from our large trading partner, the EU. The costs of carriage. Anybody who's tried to move even a parcel across to the EU or get one back will know about the costs that you see domestically, but you can multiply that by many, many times to see what's happening here. I raised a case in Parliament about a business, an importer here in Inverness, the oil and vinegar and a very popular speciality shop, who found himself saddled with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of extra charges on import costs just to import the goods that he would normally have paid, about 20 quid or so in the carriage to actually get them in. These are things that are directly affecting businesses here. They're all choices that were made, self-harm based choices that were made at Westminster. And as every day goes by, we see more and more of that. So it's really absolutely vital that we get a grip of this. Take the opportunity to make our voice heard and make sure that we get the powers in future in order to make our own choices here in Scotland.
Thanks, Drew. Now then, let's move on to our next item this evening, because Liz Truss has said that higher energy bills should be a price worth paying to guarantee the UK's security from foreign aggressors, although she admitted that the costs should not be passed on to householders. The UK's Prime Minister warned that the UK must not jeopardise its safety for the sake of cheap gas and oil from authoritarian regimes such as Russia, while speaking to journalists on her flight to the US for the UN General Assembly. Ms Truss said that the West had become too dependent on nations like Russia for energy supplies. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson had said that the price of freedom is worth paying, as the war in Ukraine drove up the price of energy, food and fuel in Britain. Mr Johnson had previously compared the conflict to defeating Nazi Germany in the Second World War. Asked whether she believed the financial pain at home in the UK was worth it, Ms Truss replied, "I think it's right that we cannot jeopardise our security for the sake of cheap energy. That's the mistake the entire Western world made post-war." So, Drew, I must admit to being a bit confused by the reporting of this statement that the Prime Minister is said to have given. She said, "I think it's right that we cannot jeopardise our security for the sake of cheap energy. That's a mistake that the entire Western world made." Now, I wanted just to pull it apart a bit. She was referring to the risk to national security from authoritarian regimes. So is she perhaps referring to her chums in Saudi Arabia as an authoritarian regime who provides gas and oil?
Well, I think she's capable of many confusing statements, and that's yet another one. The situation in Saudi Arabia has been, well exposed. That there are many human rights violations there that should be challenged, and yet they haven't been over the years. But the main thing here is and again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, the main thing here is that we could have had not only Scottish energy security. Scotland already has that. We're a net exporter of energy, but they could have had UK energy security if they'd made the right choices. But they've, over the time that the Tories have been in power, they've steadfastly refused to invest in the kind of energy that's needed. The Committee on Climate Change, said many years ago that there needed to be a rush for electricity, meaning that they had to invest in renewable projects. And yet we've seen time and time again, onshore wind being pretty much outlawed, taken away from the auctions, not being allowed to get in at the right prices there. The same with solar power being excluded from that as well, the CFD process, and of course they've had this toxic idea that they can rely on new nuclear power, which, even if it wasn't dangerous and extremely wasteful and expensive, can take 20, 30 years in order to get to the kind of place where you get any return in terms of the just generating the electricity, let alone any kind of financial return, which you won't get because it'll just continue to be more expensive all of the time. So there's a number of mixed things here, but I think it says a lot when they can glibly say that higher energy prices are a price worth paying. Of course, we've got to support Ukraine. Of course, we've got to make sure that we're investing in, giving them the military and financial aid that they need. It's pretty crass to talk about those kinds of things when people are facing an absolute crisis this winter. They're talking about setting the price cap at £2,500. It's a massive increase that people can't afford and will be hitting people and families directly over the coming months. We had an energy roundtable here in Inverness with all of the local agencies and charities and groups, and they felt quite strongly that if something wasn't done, then a lot of people would die this winter as a result of the energy costs. So it's pretty crass to talk in that way. It's also extremely crass at a time when they're talking about lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses. It adds nothing to the economy, adds nothing to the mix other than shows a really careless contempt for what people are going through.
Absolutely. Thanks, Drew. And it's interesting the language that's been changing a little bit. You mentioned the cap on bankers' bonuses, which it's now expected will evaporate on Friday as part of Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget. And also we've seen, as you say, what was the energy price cap is now referred to by the Prime Minister as an energy price guarantee. On the same flight, she said, we're going to put in place an energy price guarantee to make sure that people are able to get through this winter and next winter without those very high bills. The language struck me as quite strange. It was obvious that the energy price cap was nothing of the sort because it kept going up. And now she's telling us that she's going to give us an energy price guarantee. Does she mean she's guaranteeing that domestic energy prices are at least double what they were last year?
Well, that seems to be the case, and the other thing about this is that whilst everybody, with any kind of common sense was saying, look, some of the energy producers, maybe not the energy companies, but the energy producers have been making such enormous excess profits out of this situation that it was perfectly legitimate for them and the likes of Amazon and others who'd been making excess profits over the past few years to be taxed to pay this. Instead, what they've decided to do is tax the very people who'll have to pay the higher bills as well, because this energy price guarantee cap, whatever mechanism they come out with on Thursday for describing it, basically is going to be just Thursday or Friday. It basically is just going to be a mechanism that says we're going to give this money to the energy companies and we're going to charge you, the taxpayer, over the next coming years, probably over the next decades, for that bailout. So it's giving money to the people who don't particularly need it and taking money out of the pockets of the people that desperately need it at the same time. It is a quite bizarre way of running things. And again, when you look at the decisions that are being made at Westminster, it's absolutely crazy to be doing this kind of thing just now. We need to be supporting people with the situation where they pay no more, at the very least, no more than they're paying just now. The idea that they could face an increase is just it's ignoring the reality of the effects on people at the moment, and it's setting a very, very dangerous situation up for those folk who already can't afford the energy prices.
Thanks, Drew. Certainly, at some point, reality is going to bite, I suspect, and no doubt you and I will be discussing that again in the future on Scotland 7. Let's move on, and we'll continue to look at Liz Truss, however, because she has admitted that the UK is unlikely to achieve a free trade deal with the US for years, in a briefing to journalists on the flight to New York for the UN General Assembly. Ahead of her first bilateral meeting with Joe Biden, the Prime Minister conceded that talks were unlikely to start in the medium term. Her comments are likely to disappoint Brexiteers as she downplayed expectations that any trade agreement was imminent. Ms Truss will struggle to get talks with the US off the ground, while her threat to breach the Northern Ireland Protocol remains. This is the first time the government has conceded that there is virtually no chance of getting agreement on an early bilateral trade deal with the US, Britain's biggest trading partner, despite it being coveted by Brexit supporters as one of the major potential benefits of leaving the EU. Instead, the new Prime Minister said her priorities would be joining the Trans-Pacific Trading Partnership of 11 countries, including Australia, Canada and Singapore, as well as striking deals with Gulf states and India. So, Drew, earlier today you're quoted as saying, far from delivering on their promise of a Brexit bonanza, the Tories are watching their pledges pile up in the Brexit bin, with Liz Truss admitting that the UK has abandoned hopes of a UK US trade deal in the near future. Despite all the hyped up post Brexit rhetoric by the Tories, including Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, that a US UK trade deal would be signed, sealed, and delivered imminently, the Tory government has been forced into a humiliating climb down. So, Drew, was a trade deal between the UK and the US ever honestly anywhere near the horizon, or has it always been resting in the Brexit bin?
No, it's you've answered the question yourself, but rhetorically there it was always going to be in the Brexit bid. Nobody with any sense would have pinned their hopes on getting a US trade deal, and the US are ferocious negotiators in any case. Even if you got a sniff of that, which was never on the cards, we would have had to pay an extremely high price for such a deal. Look, the fact is that the UK has dragged us away from our biggest market. We were part of a market, 500 million people on our doorstep with really cheap and easy ways of moving goods around and getting the benefits from that. And what they've got in return so far is a couple of rollover deals that they would have, had with the EU anyway, and the no US trade deal. But we've got now the New Zealand and Australia deal, which is going through Parliament at the moment, which has really it set the standard, it set the example of what the UK can look forward to in the future. Because in a desperation to get these deals across the line, the UK government are just selling off everything. The Australia New Zealand trade deal is basically a betrayal of farmers and crofters. There's job losses that will come in the food and processing industry and reduced income. There's a loss of environmental protections. And incidentally, Andrew, I should say, this is not my assessment. This is the assessment of the National Farmers Union. The word betrayal is being used by the National Farmers Union of Scotland on these deals. The government's own figures show that the returns that they'll get for these deals are negligible. And in return, we'll have products coming into Scottish shops that have come from farms that have no protections on animal rights, from a country that is ignoring the Paris Agreement on climate change. There are no conditions in these deals just now. And also the deal that they're trying to put through Parliament at the moment, which they've got the numbers to get through. We'll obviously fight at every stage of the way, but it also includes a power grab from Holyrood, meaning that they can override some of the environmental safety checks that we have here in Scotland by giving ministers powers just to arbitrarily make decisions on what is imported into Scottish markets. So, that's a sign of what is yet to come. There is, as I say, a negligible return from these deals in terms of what will come back. It's an absolute pittance. It's literally pennies compared to the, if you take it as maybe about anywhere between 2 and 16 pence against a loss of £5 from the EU. That's the kind of balance that you get from those kinds of deals. But there is no immediate chance of a US deal. There never was any realistic chance of a quick US deal. There's a far greater chance of the EU doing a deal with the US before the UK get anywhere near it. As we've seen with the fact that the EU has done a far better deal with New Zealand and Australia that doesn't give away the things that I've just mentioned.
Thanks, Drew. That's a great way of characterising the financial impact. That really brings it home to folks. Thank you. Now, insulating homes in the UK and installing heat pumps could benefit the economy by £7 billion a year and create 140,000 new jobs by 2030, according to analysis by Cambridge Econometrics, who were commissioned by Greenpeace. However, the uptake of these energy-saving measures depends heavily on government policy. Currently, UK ministers have done little to encourage households to take up more home insulation, though the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, is expected to make an announcement on the economy and energy crisis in his mini budget on Friday. Through the boiler upgrade scheme, the government offers households up to £5,000 towards a heat pump, which is roughly half the cost. But take-up so far has been slow. To gain the government incentive, households must meet higher standards of home insulation, which can cost from £7,000 to £15,000, and for which there is currently no government support for the average homeowner. Doug Parr, the chief scientist at Greenpeace UK, said the UK is in an economic, energy and climate meltdown. Yet the government continues to shun the green home upgrades that offer a viable way out of this mess. It's truly baffling. The economic boost forecast in the Cambridge Econometrics analysis, entitled Economics Impact of Decarbonising Heating in Residential Buildings, and which was published by Greenpeace earlier today, comes mainly from savings on soaring energy bills and the creation of green jobs, and the positive impact on the rest of the economy from freeing up people's spending. There are also health and social benefits, as people living in underheated homes are more prone to illness, while lifting people out of fuel poverty improves their well-being and the education prospects for their children. According to the modelling used in the report, in 2030 the government would need to spend about £4.2 billion on supporting heat pumps and insulation, with households spending £9.3 billion. In that year, households would also save £11 billion through lower heating costs. According to the study, the investment required from the government for a scheme to subsidise insulation and install heat pumps would amount to about £27.7 billion in total between 2022 and 2030. So, Drew, savings on soaring energy bills, freeing up people's spending, the creation of green jobs, the health and social benefits, as people living in underheated homes are more prone to illness, and lifting people out of fuel poverty improves their well-being and the educational prospects for their children. Are there any downsides at all to rapidly insulating and improving the heating in homes across the UK?
Well, it's been a couple of years since I was on the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee, but one of the things that was very clear and that was put forward by the committee was that the UK government had been asleep at the wheel over insulation. At that time, the latest figures I had, Scotland, with its obviously with its limited budget, limited powers, was insulating 4 times as many homes as were per head of population as were being carried out in England, and twice as many as in Wales. But the fact of the matter was that there's just not been enough money invested in doing that, particularly in industrial properties where we could make enormous strides in terms of tackling some of the carbon releases and climate change as well. But in terms of homes, again, if the right decisions had been taken, the sensible decisions had been taken by the Tory government at Westminster a few years ago, we wouldn't be looking at the so much of the real problem that we're going to have this coming winter with the energy price crisis. Because there would have been a lot more insulation done. But of course, that just hasn't been carried out. What's worse is that the rules at Westminster on insulating homes, and particularly this is for builders across England, obviously the different planning rules in Scotland, but they actually watered these down so that new houses didn't need the same kind of serious attention to insulation as they should do. And I think that speaks volumes. I mentioned earlier in the programme about the attitude to onshore renewables and to solar, but I think it's a very, very similar story when it comes to insulating homes and properties. There just hasn't been the kind of decision making being made that looks to the future, that takes into account our needs, that balances up all of those different things, such as, if you're insulating homes, you've got a bit more energy security, you've got people who are warmer, you're less likely to have, poorer health conditions. And of course, you're starting to tackle some of the energy use that contributes to climate change. So anybody, sensibly looking with all of those powers as they have at Westminster over energy would be looking at this saying, these are the things we have to do. And of course, that was the advice that the government were getting from all of the agencies that it was employing to give it advice, but it chose ideologically to take a different view. and that's why we, don't have so many houses and properties insulated across the nations of the UK, and why in Scotland we could have done so much more if we'd had the resulting funds that we should have for it, and if we'd had the powers indeed to make those kinds of choices to do up until now. But yeah, there's no doubt it should still be done. It's still something that should be carrying great weight, and it's still something that we need to look at very, very seriously. And Westminster needs to wake up to its own need to take responsibility for doing this.
Thanks, Drew. What we'll do now is we'll look at some other political choices that have been being made over the last couple of days, and we'll come back to look at politics in Scotland now, because as the new Scottish Conservative MSP, Ros McCall, became the first MSP to take the parliamentary oath of allegiance to King Charles today, Douglas Ross has continued to hemorrhage front bench and backroom staff. Ms McCall replaces Dean Lockhart, who resigned his list seat in the Scottish Parliament, while Dumfriesshire MSP Oliver Mundell has resigned as a front bench education spokesperson earlier this month. Douglas Ross is losing several of his back office team, including Chief of Staff John Novakovic, Director of Communications David Bateman, and Head of Digital Harley Lothian. Mr Ross has replaced Mr Novakovic with Craig Patterson, who was formerly a member of New Labour and a senior policy advisor to Jim Murphy, who was a former Scottish Labour Party leader. Commenting on the appointment of Mr Patterson, the SNP MSP Paul McLennan said, "It will come as a surprise to absolutely no one that it is so easy to make the switch from advising Labour to advising the Tories. Both parties are two sides of the same coin." And as we came on air this evening, it was announced that Stephen Kerr, who was the Tories' chief whip in Holyrood, has been appointed to replace Oliver Mundell as the education spokesperson, and Alexander Burnett, who was the deputy chief whip, has been promoted into Stephen Kerr's shoes as chief whip of the Tories in Holyrood. Now, Drew, Novakovic, the chief of staff who was seen as the driving force behind the strategy to expand the Tories' support in Scotland through innovative policy ideas, is leaving. David Bateman, Director of Communications, Harley Lothian, the Head of Digital, will leave almost immediately after their UK party conference in 2 weeks' time. And Rebecca Fraser, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff, left in June. And also, I should say, in mentioning Rebecca Fraser, like Novakovic, Bateman and Lothian, she was appointed to her job almost exactly a year ago. So does this roll call of folks jumping off the good ship Douglas Ross tell us anything about the state of the Tory party in Scotland?
Well, it tells us a lot about, I think, both Douglas Ross and the Tory party. The fact that they've got this enormous churn going on is a wee bit like the churn that we get from Douglas Ross himself. Yeah, anybody will remember the fact that he was all for sacking Boris Johnson, then he was for keeping him, then he was for sacking him, then we weren't sure, and all that. And I think it must be really difficult for anybody, regardless of what your role is working in the staff for Douglas Ross, to know what the next day is going to bring. That must be a real challenge. But look, what we're seeing here is just a continuation of the kind of better together thing between Labour and the Tories. The fact that you quoted there just now, that the description of there being two heads of the same coin, it's underlined by things like this. And I would use the old joke about this being rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic, but I don't think they rearranged the deck chairs in the engineering room under the waterline. But it just feels that that's what they're doing here. The idea that these moves are going to change the fortunes of the Tory party in Scotland, are just fantasy. The idea that that they can continue to bang the drum saying that Westminster is the greatest thing for us here, when they can see what the Truss government is already doing, and it's probably looking like it's going to be worse than the Boris Johnson government. I think it's it's only somebody that could have worked with Jim Murphy that I think could possibly take this role on.
You make a good point there, Drew, about the Douglas Ross now being most known for his endlessly changing views on Boris Johnson. I wondered if that was one of the Tories' innovative policy ideas, endlessly flip flopping about whether or not Johnson should be PM. But to the point you were just making there, does this shuffling from Labour to Tory tell us anything about the talent puddle amongst unionist parties in Scotland generally?
Well, we're used to more of the same from them, and it's an ever diminishing return situation that they've got. They've been using the same lines over and over again for for the past 8 or so years. In fact, longer than that, probably for the past 10 years. And they're just recycling the same stuff all the time just now. So there's nothing new there. There's nothing innovative. There was some suggestion that they might be looking at new policy ideas in the Tory party. That's, as we've seen just now, being very short-lived. And it looks like we're going to be set up for more of the same. I don't understand it. I don't understand where they're trying to go with that. But we'll watch on with interest.
Thanks, Drew. Let's move on now, because the head of Iran's morality police in Tehran has reportedly been suspended from his post as protests swept across Iran for a third day over the killing of a 22-year-old Kurdish woman who was detained by police after being accused of not wearing the hijab appropriately. A number of respected Iranian news outlets reported that Colonel Ahmed Mirzai, the head of the Moral Security Police of Greater Tehran, had been suspended from his role after the death of Masa Amini. Tehran police denied that he had been suspended or fired. A CT scan of Amini's head has shown a bone fracture, hemorrhage, and a brain edema, seemingly confirming that she died due to being struck on the head and not from a heart condition or epilepsy, as the Tehran police had tried to claim. So, Drew, in addition to the death of Masa Amini, there are now 5 more people reported to have been killed in protests, killed having been shot by security forces. If this continues, it's going to become a serious problem for the Iranian authorities, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a serious problem for everyone involved. I mean, first of all, my sympathies to the family of the victim there, who was so tragically killed. And killed is the word, it seems. It is unacceptable in the 21st century for women to be, put under that kind of pressure where they're having to obey arbitrary rules about what they wear and how they deport themselves. And yes, there are different cultures, and we've got to understand that there are different things that happen, but it can never be acceptable for people to be treated with this kind of brutality in that kind of way. And I do think that I do hope that the pressure to change will be felt in the corridors of power in Iran, because it's overdue. It is something that they should be looking to address as quickly as possible. And this mistreatment, this targeting of women in this way, has to stop. And it shouldn't take the loss of life to force change. But that change must now happen, and if there is any good to come out of this tragedy, it must be that the Iranian authorities look at what they're doing and change direction on that.
Thanks, Drew. That's a very, very good point, well made. We'll move to Africa next, because Nigeria is battling its worst floods in a decade, with more than 300 people killed so far this year, and that includes 20 so far this week, as authorities said the situation is beyond their control. The floods in 27 of Nigeria's 36 states and capital city have affected 500,000 people, including 100,000 displaced and more than 500 injured, Nigeria's National Emergency Management Agency has said. The disaster has also destroyed thousands of hectares of farmland, worsening fears of a disruption of food supply in Africa's most populous country. Manzo Ezeki, a spokesperson for the Disaster Management Agency, said that it was the highest number of flood-related deaths Nigeria has had since 2012. Nigeria sees flooding every year, often as a result of non-implementation of environmental guidelines and inadequate infrastructure. Authorities are blaming the floods this year on water overflowing from local rivers, unusually high rainfalls, and the release of excess water from the Lagdo Dam in neighbouring Cameroon's northern region. The Nigeria Hydrological Services Agency predicted more floods in 2022 than last year due to excessive rainfalls and contributions from external flows, such as the opening of the dam in Cameroon. On Monday, Nigeria's Disaster Management Agency alerted more than a dozen states of serious consequences in the coming weeks as two of the country's dams started to overtop. In the northwest Jigawa state, floods killed more than 20 people in the last week, according to Yusuf Sani Barbura, head of the Jigawa State Emergency Management Agency. The state has recorded 91 deaths from flooding this year, more than any other state in the country. The floods have also destroyed crops, mostly in Nigeria's northern region, which produces much of what the country eats, raising concerns that they could further affect food supplies that are already disrupted by armed conflict in the country's northwest and central regions. So, Jim, we were told that the floods have destroyed crops, mostly in the northern region, and that raises concerns that they could further affect food supplies that are already disrupted by armed conflict. So, are we seeing, do you think, the combination here of armed conflict with climate change sparking starvation, conflict, and displacement of people? 100,000 people are already reported to have been displaced in Nigeria, which is, after all, Africa's most populous country.
Well, these conditions are just unimaginable for any of us that are, taking part in this broadcast or watching it tonight. What those people are having to go through is just beyond comprehension. And you're right to mention the knock-on effects from this and the other impacts that are happening in the area at the time as well. And I've mentioned it tonight a couple of times about the impact of climate change. There is no doubt that there have always been extreme weather events and unusual rainfall and things like that, but the frequency now is becoming higher. We're seeing more and more of these unusual events. We're seeing them all across the world, but where you've already got hunger, where you've already got war and and destitution, when these events hit those areas, they're particularly devastating. And it's why we need to not only be pressing the governments that we have here, and glad to see the Scottish Government taking climate change extremely seriously with world-leading targets, but also got to put pressure on the UK to deal with that. But at the same time, there's also the fact that our international aid budget at Westminster has been so drastically cut. And this isn't something that happens in isolation to us here in the nations of the UK. These events, the starvation and so forth that happen are global things, but impact on all of us. And if we fail to take our responsibilities for helping those in other nations to survive and to combat these things when they happen to them, then we're setting ourselves up for a whole series of difficulties further down the road. And we will see not only a repeat of the suffering, but a repeat of the knock-on impacts that will force people to take desperate measures into the future. So we need a longer-sighted view of this. We need to make sure that we're investing in international aid. We need to make sure that we're investing in disaster relief. We need to make sure that we're doing our bit on climate change here, at the same time as providing whatever emergency assistance we can to those people that are in trouble just now. But these are desperate times, and they're not isolated. They're happening these floods are happening in many places, and I think it's something that every government around the world will now need to look at very carefully in terms of saying how do we plan to cope with the incidents themselves, and as I've said, at the same time making sure that we're putting in place the planning to help support and try and mitigate these things for future years.
Absolutely, Drew. Thank you. As you rightly mentioned, we've seen huge flooding in recent weeks in Pakistan, and of course, Japan was hit by the typhoon Nanmadol in the last 48 hours. So, increasingly severe weather events happening all around the globe. We'll come back to the UK, however, because UK government ministers are reviewing the decisions to privatise Channel 4 and to scrap the BBC licence fee, the new Culture Secretary has said, saying she is re examining the business case. Michelle Donnellan said that as Culture Secretary, she would look at the BBC licence fee in the round, but declined to say whether it could be scrapped. Ms Donnellan also said she was revisiting the Online Harms Bill and the provisions around legal but harmful speech. All of those policies were major announcements under her predecessor, Nadine Dorries, who declined an offer to serve as Culture Secretary under Liz Truss. Ms Donnellan told BBC Radio 4's Today programme that she would take a fresh look at the benefits and costs of privatising Channel 4, which the broadcaster and others have argued would hurt the many small production companies it works with. I'm the type of politician that bases their decisions on evidence, on listening, and that's what I will be doing over the coming weeks. I will take that approach when it comes to Channel 4 and every aspect of my brief. Ms Donnellan said she would look again at the BBC licence fee after Nadine Dorries had previously announced that the next licence fee deal would be the last. So, Drew, a little bit of Westminster politics here. Interesting that perhaps Michelle Donnellan was contrasting herself with her predecessor, saying that she, Ms Donnellan, was the type of politician who bases their decisions on evidence and listening. And it struck me that Nadine Dorries was one thing as Culture Secretary. However, in Michelle Donnellan, we now have someone who's actually worked in television, albeit for the History Channel and WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment. But so do you think we might see a change in direction or emphasis from the new Culture Secretary as somebody who has actually worked in broadcasting?
Well, I'm a bit jaundiced, but let's, I've heard a lot of these things before that people will, take evidence and they'll make their decisions. And, I've seen Tory government after Tory government decide to just do things for dogma rather than those reasons. But let's be generous and say, she's coming. If she said that, then, I very much hope that she does look at the evidence. I mean, if you look at the Channel 4 sell-off, it's quite ridiculous that this broadcaster that actually survives without public subsidy, that is actually making a return, that is performing very successfully, as they trumpet every day when you put on Channel 4, they have the largest free streaming service available. To anyone in the nations of the UK, it's a good thing, and the idea that you would just sell this off to make it a kind of quasi Netflix, which A, wouldn't work, and B, just means that you would end up with far less value for it. Is quite ridiculous. So I hope she does look particularly at that. Again, with regard to the BBC license fee, I think the fact is this comes around. I think just about every year, certainly every election or every time we have a new minister, this one comes up again. It's a handy way of kind of deflecting, I think, from other problems that that ministers have, that they can throw that one out there, like famously like the dead cat on the table thing that was the expression used whenever Boris Johnson wanted to change the subject. I think it's that kind of thing. This goes round and round in circles. But yes, they should absolutely look again at the Channel 4 decision. They should cancel the decision to privatise Channel 4, and let's hope, no matter how forlornly, let's hope that there is some evidence that's taken into account and a decision is made on that basis.
Thanks, Drew. And one other question, just briefly: are things in Westminster going to be a little less colourful now that Mad Nad, as her colleagues called her, has stepped down as a minister?
You lose one of these colourful characters, and there's another one along right behind them. So I don't think we'll see too much of that. There tends to be a bit of short-term rejoicing when one Home Secretary is replaced by another. and then days later you're going, oh my goodness, this one's either just as bad or worse. It's probably the same with the culture secretary, but we'll wait and see. Who knows with the ever diminishing resources and talent pool, if you can use that expression, that the Tories have managed to work with over the past few years. We'll just have to see where that ends up. Like I say, if you're generous of spirit, you might say, well, give them a chance. If you're somebody who watches these things every day, you'll go, yeah, we're just in for more of the same, possibly worse.
More of the same. I think you're absolutely right, Drew. Thank you. And for our final item this evening, we'll come back to Scotland, because a new service, which has already saved 45,000 hospital bed days this year, is being further rolled out over the coming months. The outpatient antimicrobial therapy service allows people to be treated at home or in outpatient settings, reducing the need for admission to hospital or long stays. Patients are able to receive intravenous antimicrobial therapy or other complex antibiotic treatments in an outpatient clinic at a time convenient to them, and in some areas even at home rather than as an inpatient. The service, part of the Right Care in the Right Place initiative, is just one of the many innovative programmes which health boards are using to help reduce pressures on the rest of the system. Figures published by the Scottish Antimicrobial Prescribing Group show that between the 17th of January this year and the 21st of August, on average 250 people per week have been treated by their service, and as a result, more than 45,000 hospital admission bed days have been avoided. The OPAT services are supported by a £50 million of Scottish Government funding through the Urgent and Unscheduled Care Collaborative. The Health Secretary Humza Yousaf welcomed the news on the day when the latest A&E waiting times reached a new low, as health boards continue to recover from the pandemic. Mr Yousaf said, "I am pleased to see the rollout of the outpatient antimicrobial therapy service. We know that our accident and emergency departments continue to be under significant pressure, and that is why we are working at pace to deliver this scheme and others like it to provide more care in the community while reducing pressure on hospitals." So, Drew, the Cabinet Secretary said there was a real benefit to treating people at home where possible. And it struck me that as we enter what may become a terrifying winter for many people, having as many health professionals visiting people at home may become a really important aspect. So do you think are our services sufficiently coordinated, and are they going to be prepared well enough to deal with what they discover as they enter the homes of people during the winter, homes where people are now having to decide between heating and eating or both?
Well, I think this is a welcome move, and if you talk to health professionals about the difficulties of you're talking about the A&E times, etc. A lot of the issues are about trying to get people moved out of hospital beds, and back into their homes or into different ways of treating, so that they've got the space to use at the hospitals. We're in a country with an aging population. That's a good thing because people are living longer, but it also means that there's more pressure on the health services as a result. And no matter whether we're doing, which we are doing better on these figures than the rest of the UK, it doesn't really matter. We've got to try and do better. So anything that we do has got to be geared towards improving that and making the patient care better. I think the point you make about visiting people in their homes is a really good one. Particularly as we're facing, as you said, the potential of a real crisis this winter if nothing's done to stop that happening. And I think that would be a good thing. I think we have to bear in mind this is a new service. It's still has to grow to scale, but I'm sure where that is happening, it will be a major advantage in terms of identifying problems early on and trying to produce and procure whatever support might be required in order to help people in those circumstances. There are bigger issues here at play, as there always are, though. We need more investment across the piece. The Scottish budget is, pretty much a fixed matter. I mentioned earlier, we have no additional borrowing powers. We have to rely on the consequentials of decisions that are made at Westminster. And as we've also repeated many times on here, they're not the ones that always suit our needs. In fact, mostly they cause difficulties. So we need a complete change. We need control over of our fiscal powers so that we can make the right kinds of investments, so that we can ramp up this kind of initiative, so that it can help, amongst other things, in order to get to the place where we should be, with the wealth and resources that Scotland has, and we should be able to give the kind of patient care that we'd like to see delivered on that. But this is a good move forward. I think it has many benefits, and I'm sure that be carefully monitored to see how it can be improved and rolled out further to get the benefits, to make sure that people can get better patient care and indeed better community care as well.
Thanks, Drew. I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you. Thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and I would particularly like to thank our special guest this evening, Drew Hendry MP. Thanks, Drew.
Thank you.
Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us then. That's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.